Not everyone born into a wealthy family receives a fair inheritance, and not every legacy is written in a will. Harper Ellison spent her entire life in the shadow of a tycoon father and a perfect older sister, a dynasty built on power, reputation, and the silence of those deemed unfit. She had been excluded from every decision labeled an outsider simply because she chose science over power, because she believed in the ocean more than the boardroom. But when her father passed away and the will was read, Harper did not break down. Because she knew she held a secret, a promise from the only person who had ever truly seen her mother. From a worn envelope and a few handwritten lines, a quiet chess match spanning 2 decades began to turn. Assets no one had anticipated, strategies laid out long before, and an entirely new empire that bore no need for the father's name. Everything was being passed to the daughter once dismissed as different. Harper's story isn't about revenge. It's about reclaiming a place through principle. A transfer of power that didn't just shake an entire family, but awakened a sister, challenged a system, and redefined the very notion of legacy. This isn't a fairy tale. This is how one woman chose to rewrite the definition of success, not with bloodlines, but with intellect, compassion, and unwavering resolve. The boardroom was thick with the air of power and pressure, early sunlight slicing through the heavy curtains, casting long shadows across the mahogany table. Harper Ellison sat still back, straight hands placed neatly on her lap. Across the table, Camilla, her older sister, sat with her legs crossed, draped in the black dress of a triumphant businesswoman, her hair styled so precisely that not a single strand dared fall out of place. Mr. Bennet, the family's long-standing attorney, lowered his head to adjust his silver-framed glasses, his voice deep and steady, as he began to read the will. All real estate properties under the ownership of Mr. Walter Ellison, the house at 14 Hawthorne Lane, the vacation villa in Crystal Shore, along with all executive shares and assets under Ellison Global, are hereby transferred entirely to Camilla Ellison. No one said a word. Not a single sigh, not a single protest. But inside Harper, the silence rang like a funeral bell. She had expected this. She had sensed it from the moment she stepped into the wood-paneled room with the old grandfather clock. Still, she had hoped for something else, something fairer. Camilla turned to her with a faint, smug smile, the smile of someone who wins and never needs to say, "Thank you." The diamond-encrusted bracelet on her wrist caught the light gifted by their father last year, at a party Harper hadn't been invited to. No explanation, no inclusion. Just a default absence. Harper had never been the daughter Walter Ellison chose. Not when she pursued marine biology instead of business. Not when she decisively divorced the man her father handpicked after he openly cheated. And certainly not when she refused to become a replica of Camilla, the perfect daughter, the heir, the only one entrusted with the legacy. Mr. Bennet's voice rose again, dry and mechanical, as though reading an inventory of repossessed assets. Additionally, a small account containing family heirlooms and a few of the great-grandmother's pieces of jewelry will be transferred to Harper Ellison. Camilla let out a light chuckle as if unable to hold back her mockery. At least you've got some family photos. The only question is, where will you hang them in that tiny apartment of yours? Harper stood up without responding. Her dress was immaculate, her gaze steady and unshaken. "Are we done here, Mr. Bennet?" she asked. He nodded quickly, perhaps silently relieved that she hadn't caused a scene like so many others at will readings. But no one knew that Harper's silence had never been compliance. She didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She simply walked out one measured step at a time, leaving behind a family structure that had long ceased to include her. Because what her father left to Camilla was a decaying empire. And Harper, though still unsure of what awaited, carried with her a promise, and a door quietly left open by the one person who had truly believed in her. On the drive back to her small apartment nestled in the Williamsburg neighborhood, the roadside trees shed golden leaves one by one. Harper drove without turning on the radio. The silence wrapped around her like a thick shell, not sad, not angry, just an unfamiliar emptiness expanding in her chest, the kind one only feels when the final piece of expectation has slipped through their fingers. Her apartment was neither luxurious nor dazzling like Camilla's penthouse, but every tile, every lamp, every wicker chair placed in the corner had been chosen by Harper herself. She had lived there for 3 years since the day she divorced and refused to become an accomplice in the hollow marriage her father had arranged. That home was not just a shelter, it was evidence of the free choices she had once dared to make. Harper took off her shoes, poured herself a glass of water, and walked to the small study at the end of the hallway. The oak desk by the window still had a locked drawer she hadn't opened in 2 years. She picked up the bundle of keys from her jewelry box, a habit from when her mother was still alive, and gently turned the lock. Inside was a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed tight with familiar handwriting. Open only after your father has passed. Promise me, Alexandra. Harper froze. She still remembered the day her mother Eleanor gave her that envelope. Her mother had just returned from a doctor's visit, looking tired and distant, but her hand held Harper's tightly. I believe in you. Only you. When the time comes, you'll understand. Harper took a deep breath and carefully opened the envelope. A faint scent of old paper rose up, carrying with it a wave of longing for the gentle woman who had been overshadowed all her life by her husband and eldest daughter. Inside were dozens of neatly clipped documents, ownership certificates, investment accounts in Iceland, Luxembourg, and Singapore, financial records from clean energy companies, profit and sustainable growth analyses, all bearing Harper's name. On top lay a handwritten letter, the cursive slanted delicately. To my beloved Alexandra. Harper read slowly, each word pouring straight into her heart. Her mother had quietly invested in green tech companies for the past 20 years, starting the day she heard Harper passionately explain the dangers of plastic pollution and coral reef degradation. While her father dismissed his daughter's research as fanciful and useless, her mother had quietly used her own savings to bet on values Walter Ellison had never cared to understand. Each line of the letter was a song of belief. Eleanor didn't just believe in her daughter's ideals, she believed in the world's future if placed in the right hands. And now everything had been passed on without formal announcements, without lawyers, through a love that was quiet, enduring, and precise, like an underground current. Harper sat motionless for a long time, her hands trembling as she turned page after page. Her eyes were moist, but in her heart surged a fierce awakening. Her father had left behind a legacy of power and voice. But her mother, the one always seen as just tending the garden, had left her an empire, along with one final message. Use it to change the world the way you always wanted to. The next morning, Harper woke earlier than usual. She didn't eat breakfast or make coffee. She simply sat in front of the stack of documents spread across the table as if standing at the most significant crossroads of her life. The numbers were no longer dry financial data, they were declarations. Every statement, every rising stock proved that her mother didn't just believe in her, she had wagered her entire life on the future Harper could create. Carefully, Harper organized the files, marked the key investment milestones, and quietly called the only person she thought needed to see this first, Camilla. The call lasted only 4 sentences. Are you free? I think we need to talk. At my place? Tomorrow morning. Camilla didn't ask further, her tone as even as always, but Harper knew she would come because Camilla never passed up a chance to assert superiority over her sister. At exactly 10 a.m. the doorbell rang. Camilla stepped in with a crocodile leather handbag, beige high heels, and her familiar gaze a blend of politeness, superiority, and guardedness. She looked around the apartment as though appraising a temporary space. Harper, if this is about getting your life back on track, I'm more than happy to help. I could get you a coordinator role in the communications department. Something not too demanding. Harper didn't reply, simply led her to the dining table where the documents had been neatly arranged, numbered, and categorized. She pulled out a chair, gestured for Camilla to sit, and silently slid the first folder in front of her. This is what Mom left behind. Not in the will, in her heart. Camilla raised an eyebrow and opened the first file. She flipped through quickly, then slowed down her eyes, scanning each section: renewable energy, seawater filtration technology, coral reef restoration projects, a chain of equity holdings in Sweden, Germany, and Canada. All under Harper's name, legal, legitimate, with certified documentation and a clear transfer history. A tense silence hung over the small kitchen. Camilla finally looked up, her face slightly pale, her voice noticeably lower. Mom? Did all of this? Harper nodded. For over 20 years. It started with a small fund she managed on her own. No one knew. Not even Dad. Camilla tried to regain her footing. But if she did all that, why didn't she split it equally? Why leave it all to you? Harper looked straight into her sister's eyes, not with anger or defiance, but with clarity forged from years of silence. Because I was the only one who ever listened to her. I believed the world needed healing. You've always believed that power had to be inherited. Camilla froze her hand, gripping the edge of the folder. So what do you plan to do now? Harper stood gathering the documents, then answered calmly. I plan to begin. With or without your cooperation. Camilla said nothing else. As she stepped toward the door, she turned back, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. But Harper knew, in that moment, for the first time in her life, her sister understood the one who speaks the loudest doesn't always hold power. It's the one with vision and the patience to wait for the right moment to speak. That afternoon, the phone rang incessantly. Harper glanced at the list of missed calls and messages flooding her screen. Family names flashed one after another like a panicked chorus. Uncle Richard, Aunt Evelyn, Cousin Max, even a distant relative in Connecticut whose name she'd nearly forgotten. Each had a reason, a tone, some accusatory, some persuasive, some suddenly concerned. All roads led to a single center, the seismic shift of power that had just occurred within the Ellison family. Clearly, Camilla had failed to keep the truth contained. News of the secret fortune their mother had left behind had spread like wildfire, and Harper, the once misfit shadow, was now the new focal point of the entire lineage. She turned off her phone, disabled social media apps, and grabbed her coat before heading out. Her first move wasn't to react, but to fortify. The law offices of Grant and Rowe occupied the 17th floor of a glass tower in Soho. Harper entered calm, but with steely eyes. Mrs. Sophia Grant, her mother's longtime legal counsel, sat behind a walnut desk, the ceiling light casting shadows across her silver-gray hair. I assume you've opened the letter, she said, skipping any preamble. Harper nodded and placed the stack of documents on the desk. I need to be sure, is there any legal basis for someone to contest what my mother did? Mrs. Grant let out a soft chuckle, not mocking, but as if she found something admirable in Harper's composure. Eleanor wasn't the kind of person to leave loose ends. She planned for every possibility, especially the one where Camilla might attempt to undermine the legal validity of these transfers. From a drawer, she pulled out another thick file and laid it on the desk. It's all here: meeting minutes with financial advisors, video recordings of discussions with an independent attorney, even a psychiatric evaluation certifying she was of sound mind throughout the process. Your mother didn't just leave you assets, Harper. She left a chess match with every move completed. Harper turned the pages, her heart both touched and awed. Her mother hadn't just prepared financially, she'd mentally braced herself for the family's resistance. She understood Camilla's mindset well: blind faith in status, power, and reputation. But she also understood that some things are built not through press conferences, but through quiet determination and time. As Harper exited the office, she no longer felt alone. Not because there was now a legal team standing behind her, but because she finally realized she was continuing down a path her mother had quietly carved out 2 decades earlier. A path that didn't appear in headlines, wasn't applauded by her father, but was measured by the survival of the planet, the voice of the next generation, and the decisions people may not understand today, but will be grateful for tomorrow. While Harper was reviewing the investment records her mother had left behind, a thought struck her like a sudden light in the night. If Ellison Global, her father's brainchild, was a fortress built on outdated foundations, then why not let the truth do what it does best: expose? She spent 3 consecutive nights compiling every environmental report related to Ellison Global's operations over the past decade: fossil fuel extraction, substandard waste management, refusal to commit to ESG standards, and most notably, a persistent disregard for the global sustainability movement. These documents, once dismissed from boardroom agendas, were now shaped by Harper into a targeted analysis aimed directly at the company's weakest point: investor trust. She didn't need a grand meeting, just one email. A contact list of institutional investors, strategic shareholders, and environmental regulatory agencies all received the report on the same Tuesday morning. No explanation, no sign of rebellion, just a truth released at the right time. Within 48 hours, Ellison Global's stock dropped over 12%. Financial forums erupted and CNBC headlined "A Legacy on Shaky Ground." But what worried Camilla the most wasn't the numbers, it was the silence from the company's closest investors. The same people who once shook her hand at summits were now busy. Lunch meetings were canceled, pledges quietly withdrawn. She understood exactly what that meant. So when Camilla showed up at Harper's doorstep later that week, no words were needed to guess why. She no longer carried her usual arrogance, no smug smile, no empty phrases. Instead, she offered what seemed like a sincere proposal. "Harper, if we join forces, you have the resources, I have the infrastructure. Morgan Communications, or rather Ellison Global, still holds influence. If we pivot quickly, we can save it. Save father's legacy." Harper sat across from her, hands calmly clasped, her voice steady as stone. "You received what he left you. I received what she left me. But I have no intention of extending the inertia of a dying empire. I don't need to save Ellison Global. I'm building something else, not from inheritance, but from ideals." Camilla froze for a moment. She wasn't used to being refused, especially not by her younger sister. But this time, Harper wasn't reacting out of hurt. She was making a deliberate, strategic decision, one rooted in a vision beyond family rivalry. The silence spread through the small kitchen like a lake surface disrupted by wind. Eventually, Camilla stood up, her expression no longer angry but bewildered. "You're making a serious mistake," she said, grasping for a final thread of authority. Harper didn't nod, didn't refute. She just smiled softly, as if speaking to herself. "Maybe. But at least it's my mistake. And I'll own it." News of the internal fracture within Ellison Global spread rapidly like an oil slick across a still lake. That same week, Harper received a copy of the emergency board meeting transcript. The primary investor had withdrawn, financial support packages were suspended, and CEO Camilla Ellison was asked to step down temporarily while a comprehensive strategic review was conducted. Just as Harper predicted, sustainability was no longer a decorative term in annual reports. It had become a vital metric in the eyes of the market. Analysts called it a post-will ethical crisis, where the company founded by Walter Ellison was being driven to the brink by the very arrogance and antiquated values he embodied. Harper didn't celebrate. No posts, no press interviews, no smug remarks. Instead, she spent the following day at the Stanford University Laboratory, where Dr. Alan Chen and his research team were struggling to secure funding to expand their marine microbiology cleanup project. In a room filled with chemical fumes and fluorescent lights, Harper signed a new sponsorship agreement worth $4 million, drawn from the fund her mother had built to support the continuation of their second phase. When Alan, momentarily speechless, tried to thank her, Harper simply smiled and said, My mother invested in this work back when your name was still being misspelled in internal memos. She believed in you. Now it's my turn. That evening, when Harper returned home, Camilla was standing at the door. Gone was the air of superiority. Gone was the language of a CEO, just a woman standing in the midst of a storm she had helped create. She didn't step inside immediately, only stood beneath the awning arms wrapped around herself, as if shielding from the early winter chill. "We need to talk," Camilla whispered, her voice hoarse. Inside, Harper had already prepared a pot of peppermint tea. They sat across from each other, not out of familial obligation for the first time, but because something inside them both needed untangling. Camilla explained that the executive board was divided. Some members proposed selling off unprofitable sectors. Others wanted to find a savior partner to preserve what was left of Ellison Global. She admitted, eyes avoiding Harper's, that her entire life had followed their father's script: what to study, who to love, how to dress, and ultimately, how to manage a company she had never truly believed in. "I've destroyed everything, haven't I?" she asked, as if waiting for a sentence to be passed. Harper looked at her sister for a long moment, then opened her laptop. On the screen was her 10-year sustainable market development plan, something she had been refining day by day. "No, you haven't destroyed it," she said softly but firmly. "You just tried to preserve something that no longer has a place in a world that's already moving forward. But if you truly want to begin again, maybe it's not too late." In that moment, for the first time since their father's death, Camilla nodded without saying a word. No promises, no facades, just a simple nod, and in her eyes Harper saw a fracture, not one of collapse, but one through which light might finally enter. 1 year after the fateful confrontation, Harper stood at the podium at Half Moon Bay, with the world's first ocean waste filtration system she had funded, gleaming in the sunlight behind her, a steel structure anchored in jade-colored waters. Journalists, scientists, investors, and students from all over had gathered not to celebrate a company, but to witness a shift. Throughout her speech, Harper never mentioned her father's name or Ellison Global. She spoke only of Eleanor, the mother who had quietly planted the seeds 20 years ago by believing in things her husband had once dismissed as fanciful dreams. Today, Harper said, is not just a victory for science or the environment. It's a victory for those who've stayed silent for far too long but never let go of their ideals. As she stepped off the podium, the applause roared like waves crashing against stone. Then she caught a familiar figure in the last row, Camilla, dressed in a simple shirt, no makeup, no necklace, no trace of the once powerful CEO. She stood silently, didn't wave, didn't call. Harper's name, just gave a quiet nod. Harper nodded back. Between them now were no more arguments, no business plans or partnership clauses, only a silent acknowledgement from two people who once stood on opposite ends of a fractured legacy. That afternoon, Harper drove to the Marine Education Center in Santa Cruz, where she'd heard Camilla was volunteering. She didn't know what she expected: an apology, an explanation. But when she arrived, she saw Camilla sitting among a group of children teaching about the water cycle and how plastic disrupts ocean life. There was no microphone, no camera, just innocent questions, and a woman answering them with a patience Harper had never seen in her sister. After the lesson, Camilla walked over, chalk dust still clinging to her face. "I'm not great with kids," she said softly, as if unsure she could take credit for what she'd just done. Harper simply smiled. "Funny, the kids just said you were the most fun teacher they've ever had." Camilla stayed quiet for a long moment, then exhaled, perhaps for the first time, truly allowing herself to breathe. "I think I spent so long trying to be who Dad wanted me to be that I forgot to ask who I really was." Harper turned to look at her sister, her gaze no longer sharp but gentle like a shoreline after the tide. "Then, maybe it's time to start asking yourself a new question. Who do you want to be?" There was no resolution, no hand-holding, no embrace. But in the pale dusk of that evening, they stood together by the sea, like two separate parts of a mother who had understood that sometimes, to bring her daughters together, what was needed wasn't the equal division of assets, but the planting of two very different paths, then letting life guide them to meet again at the intersection of growth. One October afternoon, Harper was finishing a report on the progress of a coral regeneration system off the coast of Fiji when the doorbell rang. It was Sophia Grant, the lawyer who had been with her family for over 20 years. In her hand was a thick envelope with faded gold trim carefully sealed with red wax, the familiar handwriting on the front instantly recognizable: Eleanor Ellison. The final letter. Harper carefully opened it, each line of blue ink seeming to rise from a distant past but still full of life. If you're reading this letter, it means a year has passed since you learned the truth. And I hope you've used that time not just to build, but to understand. To see more clearly the lesson I myself took years to learn: that hurt is not always a fault. In each paragraph, Eleanor didn't just talk about wealth or investment strategies. She spoke of Camilla, the sister Harper had spent most of her life resisting. She didn't defend her, didn't excuse her. But she saw the softness behind the strength, the daughter forced to grow up inside a mold within expectations under the cold gaze of a father who allowed no deviation. Camilla may never have stood beside you, but you've also never seen your sister's fear. The fear of getting it wrong, of not being loved. I saw it. And I've left something for both of you: a chance, if you're willing. Harper read the final paragraph over and over, the part where her mother mentioned a separate fund created specifically for environmental education, one that would only be activated if Camilla truly changed and wanted to contribute. Eleanor entrusted Harper with full authority. No conditions, no pressure, just a chance. A final lesson in trust. Harper folded the letter and sat in silence for a long time. In her mind, she kept seeing Camilla among the children, her eyes lighting up when one of them asked, "Why is the ocean bluer when it's cleaner?" And her sister's answer wasn't just fact, but feeling. That evening, Harper invited Camilla for dinner. Not at a restaurant, no reporters, just a simple meal on the back porch where their mother used to grow lavender. Before the main course was served, Harper handed her the envelope. "It's from Mom," she said, "and it's for you." Camilla opened the letter, reading each line as if she had just found a shattered piece of the past. Finally, she looked up. "You trust me that much?" Harper didn't answer right away. She poured more wine, her gaze drifting toward the soft purple horizon. "I'm not sure it's trust. Maybe it's just a choice. But Mom chose to give you a chance. And I'm choosing to honor that." Camilla didn't cry, but her voice cracked when she said, "I used to think I was strong because I controlled everything. But it turns out the hardest thing is admitting I was wrong." Harper placed her hand on the table, not to hold, not to push away, just there, like a bridge. And perhaps for the first time, Camilla understood what it meant to step across. One early morning, the sky was crystal clear, and soft sunlight cast a thin golden veil over the small garden behind Harper's house. The wind stirred the late-blooming lavender, releasing the familiar herbal scent their mother once used to perfume handkerchiefs. Camilla was bent over a cluster of white roses, her old gardening gloves stained with soil. Harper stood silently in the doorway, holding 2 cups of tea, watching her sister gently tend to each petal, as if relearning how to touch the world with the tenderness she had long forgotten. Today was Eleanor Ellison's birthday. No flowers, no cake, no greetings, just 2 daughters who had finally learned how to stay beside each other without causing pain. Harper set the tea on the stone table and handed Camilla the detailed plan for the environmental education program they had been building together for the past 3 months. From a few pilot classes in Santa Cruz, Camilla had expanded it into a network of community schools collaborating with marine biologists, volunteers, and retired teachers. Children who once knew the ocean only through screens now got to dive in it, observe plankton firsthand, and understand why a plastic bag could kill a sea turtle. The kids asked if we could add a biology lab section, Camilla said lightly, tracing the paper's edge. What do you think about designing it with me? Harper nodded, smiling. There was no hesitation in her eyes anymore, no distance, only a quiet acknowledgement Camilla had truly changed. No longer the CEO clinging to the legacy of their father, but someone stepping forward not to salvage the past, but to rewrite a different future. That night, as Harper entered her study, she looked at two framed photos hanging side by side. One of her mother kneeling in the garden, hands covered in dirt, a radiant smile on her face. The other of Camilla in front of an outdoor classroom holding a coral model surrounded by laughing children. There is no legacy more enduring than transformation. Eleanor hadn't built a financial empire, she had planted a new way of seeing the world, a vision that might take a lifetime to reach. And now her two daughters, once on opposite ends of a fractured family, were slowly finding each other through what once seemed like irreconcilable differences. Before turning off the lights, Harper received a message. It was from Camilla. The kids asked if you could tell them a story about Mom. Not Eleanor, the mother who changed the future. May I? Harper replied with just 2 words. Tell it. Because now, when wounds know how to heal, there's no longer a need to fight for the right to tell the story. They just need to keep writing the next chapter with more kindness, more humanity, and more courage. The way Eleanor always believed they could. Some battles within families don't end with winners and losers, but with awakening when someone is brave enough not to repeat the mistakes of the generation before. Harper didn't need to reclaim Ellison Global to prove her worth. She chose another path to build, to nurture, to empower, and, most importantly, to forgive. Because true legacy isn't measured in assets distributed, but in what you leave behind in others' hearts, and in the future you help shape. Eleanor had seen that, and Harper made it real. If you've ever felt unrecognized in your own family, if you've been pushed aside for choosing differently, this story is a reminder you don't need permission to be great. You just need to begin. Subscribe to our channel to follow more profound and inspiring stories about family identity and choice. And don't forget to share this video if you believe that sometimes the most extraordinary thing is when someone dares to walk a different path to create a new one.